So let's get to the regulations. The first two regulation changes that the court dealt with were changes to the consultation requirements. So can you explain to us what consultation is and when it is required under the statute?
Yeah, so it's required anytime a federal agency action may affect listed species. And that's been found to be a pretty low bar. Like if there's a chance that you're going to be affecting a species, then you need to consult. And that is pretty detailed in the statute how that process occurs. It begins with the agency providing a biological assessment, um, looking at what effects they think it has, Fish and Wildlife Service taking that biological assessment and then producing a biological opinion that has reasonable and prudent measures. And the regulations, they were actually from 1981, so from the Reagan administration going back to then, um, said that, in looking at projects, they had to look at interrelated and interdependent actions. That was part of it. So it's, you're building, it's the transportation administration building a highway or funding a highway. What effects, are going to stem from that highway. There's going to be development, and that how's that development? So they've had to, the idea was that they had to consider all the possible effects of the action in question as part of the biological opinion and ensure that those effects are minimized. Um, and so part of the regulations, really struck at that, really tried to limit how much sort of ancillary effects would you look at. And so they said they would only, say you're building a highway, they would only look at the development from that highway if it wouldn't occur but for that highway and if they were reasonably certain to occur. So they really tried to cabin the effects of the action and what was minimized to the specific action itself. And in a climate context, and actually so far they're still getting away with this. They won't look at emissions and how emissions affect species because they say it doesn't, they can't quantify it partially, but they also say it doesn't meet that but for test. Emissions are a global phenomenon. Even if the government's permitting, say, a new coal plant or oil and gas drilling on the outer continental shelf, they're not going to look at how that'll affect species because it's part of this global process and global warming will happen anyway. It doesn't meet that but for test, which is unfortunate. So that was the first part of what we challenged and what we won on is that hinging on but for and reasonably certain to occur. And the court found that it's inconsistent with the statute because the statute says when producing a biological opinion, when analyzing the effects of the action, they have to rely on the best available information. And that's been interpreted by the courts to mean available, not perfect, not certain. And so the court concluded reasonably certain to occur violated that essentially it was a higher standard. And, you could say, but we don't know if that development's going to occur because of the highway. It's not reasonably certain to occur, so we don't have to analyze it.
Mhm.
Even if there was information to say, well, clearly that's why they're building the highway is for this development. And so that is likely to happen, and therefore it should be looked at and minimized.
I have that in my notes, and which could easily be wrong. But that the real focus that I focused on was the difference between what you just said, likely to occur, which had been the standard, and to this shift that you mentioned, reasonably certain to occur. Was that difference a touchstone for the court? Because I have to say that the difference between likely and reasonably certain to occur seems really obvious. They don't mean the same thing. Even in common talk, even in common like chatter, like I'm likely to go to the store lady later. I'm reasonably certain I'm going to the store. I mean, they mean different things in
Yeah,
English.
I think that's right. And the court did really key in on that. And I think they, and I mean, one thing that the court keyed onto as well, and that I think was right was, that defendants tried to essentially make that argument like, oh, it's the same, and then the court was like, well, if it's the same to you, then why even make the change? And so they're like, that's completely disingenuous, and
That's
I think
hilarious.
I think it was clear that they were making the change because they wanted to limit the scope of consultation to the actual, just the footprint.
To only things that you can say are reasonably certain to occur if we build this highway.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas likely is just more likely than not. Like probably going to happen, and we should look at that.
That is really funny. Like the statute says likely, they changed it to reasonably certain to occur, and then they said, well, they mean the same thing. And the court's like, well, then why did you change it? Yeah. All right. I know that the court also found that the change was arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act. And I'm assuming that the difference in whether something was found to be facially invalid or invalid under the Administrative Procedure Act has to do with, if it's facial, it means that it contradicts the Endangered Species Act. And if it's arbitrary and capricious, it means they didn't follow the appropriate procedure in doing this. Is that right?
Yeah, they didn't explain, is what the court found. That if you're going to change, if you're going to make a change, like you have a long-standing regulation and then you change it, you have to have some reason for that. You have to explain that. Otherwise, it's arbitrary and capricious. And they didn't offer a good enough explanation. What they said was, it used to be that there were indirect effects and interrelated effects. And for indirect effects, they did use that reasonably certain to occur language in the regs before. And they said, well, we were just making it consistent. We're just having it applied to any effects that we're looking at.
Yeah.
And that's, it's clear. That was their explanation, which isn't an explanation at all.
No,
so,
like
the court,
we were wrong before, so we decided to be wrong again. All right. That's all I have on that the first issue. If there's nothing else, I can go on to the second issue, which also related to Section 7, consultation, and I think was a different aspect of the same regulation. Is that right? And it had to do with ensuring that a project will not jeopardize listed species. Am I right? And there's a Ninth Circuit decision which I thought was interesting, talking about having a stated intention to make them. If you want to go into that, feel free.
Yeah, that was a really important finding, because in several cases the courts have found that agencies can often promise to do things, or even private entities. Actually, we had a case over a pipeline that they were going to build in Oregon called Ruby Pipeline, where they tried to do this. They had various measures as part of the proposed project that they said they were going to do to try and avoid impacts from this pipeline. And Fish and Wildlife Service tried to rely on those, even though they're not essentially terms and conditions in the biological opinion. They're not enforceable, say, by us or another outside party. If those aren't, they're just in the project description. And, they were essentially, what the regulations tried to do was to say that if an agency or a private party said they were going to do something, made some big promises about doing something, Fish and Wildlife Service had to accept that on its face. They couldn't question it. They couldn't say, yeah, but do you actually have funding for that? Do you actually have concrete plans to do that? And so I was really glad to see that get rejected, because people can promise all kinds of things in
Like,
order
do they
to
live
avoid,
in the real world? Like,
yeah,
what are they
exactly.
even talking about?
Yeah, exactly. And so I was really glad to see that overturned. And, what it essentially says is, if there's terms and conditions to minimize the effects to a listed species, those have to be binding terms and conditions, and they have to be enforceable. And so that's really a good outcome.
So there's some kind of contractual or other way in which the promise can be enforced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We, for example, as watchdogs, the Center for Biological Diversity could read the biological opinion and say it requires X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z didn't happen, therefore they're in violation, and go to court over that. But if it just has vague promises in the project description and says, oh yeah, we're thinking about doing this, then
That's insane.
And then they don't do it. Yeah, it is. It is insane. It's true.